UN NGO as well for making this event happen. It's very exciting to get to do this event a second year in a row. I hope we continue to have interesting family policy research presented at the UN each year in the future. We're going to have three researchers present three very different papers representing very different family policies from different parts of the world. And the reason we do this is because every policy touches on family. There's almost nothing you can do that doesn't impact families. So our first one is on childcare. You can probably imagine how childcare affects families. There may be other policies that you have to think of it. Is that family policy? It is. So with that, our first researcher to talk will be Anna Claire Flowers. She's an economist studying barriers to family formation. She's a PhD candidate at George Mason University and a PhD fellow with the Mercatus Center. And she currently works with the NEA Regulatory Research Center to track state-level childcare policy trends using Childcare Regulation Index. So, yeah.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to present this work today. Like Lyman said, I'm going to be talking about the relationship between childcare regulations and fertility gaps, which I will explain shortly. But I want to start by drawing your attention, maybe. We're just going to do a little, oh, there we go. Drawing your attention to work-family compatibility. So parents around the world, and I'm sure many in this room, know the task of combining one's career and family is an important consideration in fertility decisions. Nobel laureate and economist Claudia Goldin has documented women's approaches to career and family in 5 generational cohorts since 1900. And the evidence is overwhelming that the majority of women today want to engage in professional work and consume time with their children. Now, I say consume time with children because it alludes to an overlooked point in childcare research and policy making. And this point is that parents want childcare options that fit their unique work needs and allow them to spend high quality time with their children. For example, a parent running her own business may need childcare for 2 or 3 afternoons per week instead of full time. Maybe imagine a parent in shift work needing to hire childcare early in the morning or after business hours. Maybe a parent who travels intermittently needs more childcare some weeks than others. A one-size-fits-all childcare model can overlook many families. So if compatibility between career and family is a major factor in fertility decisions, but each family is unique, what are the barriers to achieving a flexible ideal that accommodates both career and family? We think rigid childcare markets could be one barrier. Regulation policy is not typically thought of as family policy, but in areas that are especially relevant to young families can have a very big impact. Last year at this event, my colleague Lyman Stone introduced the concept of the fertility gap, which is the difference between desired family size and family size outcomes. You can see in this graph in the red dots that women's desired family size has decreased since the 1950s, but remains between 2 and 2.5 children per woman. While actual outcomes measured by the total fertility rate, which are the blue and purple lines, are below 2 in Europe, North America, and Australia, which along with East Asian countries have had the sharpest fertility decline in this period shown on the screen. It's in the interest of governments to find ways for women to achieve their fertility goals. This is a basic tenet of human flourishing, and it's something that's expressed in terms of our own ideals for our lives. Of course, when women are surveyed in early adulthood, they may not know how many children they will be able to have, of course. But the interesting thing about the fertility gap is that it varies significantly across states and regions, implying that in some areas, women are relatively more successful at achieving their desired family size. The variation also gives us a clue that this is a policy problem, that certain policy environments are shaping women's ability to reach their fertility goals. The fertility gap metric removes a normative standard of what family size should be by giving survey respondents the opportunity to express their own ideal. Fertility gaps are highest among women with higher educational attainment, implying that the affordability of children might not be as pertinent as the compatibility question Goldin and others have raised. So my co-authors and I are the first to study the relationship between childcare regulation and these fertility gaps, specifically in the US. The data we use to estimate fertility gaps is a survey of over 13,000 US women ages 18 to 44, polled across the years 2020 to 2024. We then compare stated fertility preferences to the total fertility rate in each US state. As this map describes, we see the smallest gap in the southern and western regions and the largest gaps in the northeast and west coast, with darker shading indicating larger fertility gaps. Rhode Island's fertility gap of 1.42 children tells us that on average, women in Rhode Island are having 1.42 fewer children than desired across their life cycle. So the average woman wanted between 2 and 3 perhaps, but is only having 1. The US average is 0.79, meaning most women are having about 1 less child than they planned. Of course, it's strange to talk about children in terms of decimals, but you can see that this is an average per state across those women surveyed. We constructed a childcare regulation index to compare the regulations on childcare providers across the US states. The index was constructed based on 4 major areas of regulation you can see on the screen: child to staff ratios, group size regulations, required annual training hours, and minimum education requirements for staff. These variables are also collected at the age group level. Louisiana scored highest, Connecticut scored lowest, and I'll break down a few of the components of this index. In New York, the maximum child to staff ratio for a group of pre-K children is 8:1, around 4-year-olds there. In North Carolina, the maximum child to staff ratio for the same age group is 20:1. Illinois requires preschool teachers to have a high school diploma and 60 college credit hours, plus additional training and experience to become licensed. 3 states in the US only require an associate's degree in early childhood education, while 10 states require a GED or less. One limitation of state regulations is their failure to take local features into consideration, such as the absence of a college-level early childhood education program in a rural area, for example. Another one I like to mention is the average is about 75 square feet per child of space, and something like 50 square feet per child of outdoor covered cushioned playground space. If you live in New York, you understand that maybe getting that outdoor playground space might be very difficult, whereas in a rural area it'd be a lot easier. So here on the map, higher index scores represent more openness in the childcare market, or more childcare freedom. In this map, the states with darker shading have more childcare freedom, and you can see that in these states, childcare providers in the southern and western states have more discretion on how to operate their businesses. Now, of course, another factor to consider is quality of care. Research has shown that tightening childcare regulations on group size and staff-to-child ratios directly increase childcare prices without having observable effects on child safety outcomes. I can go into more detail about this in the Q&A. But increased overhead from regulations, if you think about the intuition, cuts into employee wages as well, in addition to increasing prices for parents. And this can make it difficult for center directors to retain teachers and build high quality care environments. They have a lot of turnover. The variables that are included in our index represent marginal changes in group size or staff to child ratios, while safety protocols such as background checks are going to remain in place. Childcare providers also can always provide a higher quality of care if that is what their consumers are looking for. But the starting point for entering the childcare market is more attainable when the licensing regulations are lower. So in our study, we kind of start from this basis. So we think that families trying to achieve compatibility between work and parenting may be served by greater flexibility in the childcare market. With fewer regulations and more discretion on how to run a childcare business, we expect more providers to open their doors to enter this market. In an expanding childcare market, businesses compete to provide low prices, high quality, and flexible hours. This makes matching with a childcare provider easier and can encourage people that career and family can work for them. When we test this theory, we find empirical evidence that more childcare freedom is related to smaller fertility gaps. So in states with those higher childcare freedom scores, actual fertility is closer to desired fertility. Childcare freedom is just one aspect of labor market freedom that can influence fertility decisions. And it's likely through this very important channel of flexibility and work-family compatibility. The impact of the regulatory environment, as you can see from this graph, I'll help. So the far left is our kind of impact of childcare regulation becoming more free on fertility gaps. So that negative coefficient there is telling us that it's shrinking our fertility gap when we increase childcare freedom. But it has a stronger effect on fertility gaps than the share of married adults, the share of religiously affiliated adults, and the urban density, which were all taken into consideration in our study among other state level variables. So it's kind of an average for the state along with the average childcare regulation score for the state. So then the negative effect here just predicts a smaller fertility gap as childcare freedom scores increase. And again, because that ideal family size is expressed by the woman herself, we can say a smaller fertility gap is a good thing. Many countries have centralized childcare programs instead of a childcare market. What is the relevance of our findings for such countries? It is important to acknowledge that not all families want the same thing when it comes to their child's early education experience, and this applies in every context. Instead of providing subsidies, economists tend to favor vouchers as a way to preserve competition and variety among businesses, which especially serves families in those unconventional work arrangements. So to conclude, our analysis shows that if the most regulated state adopted a model of the least regulated state, it could experience a fertility increase of up to 13% in terms of total fertility rate. Such a pattern prediction rivals the results of other expensive fiscal programs, such as Quebec's $10 per day childcare subsidy plan. Regulatory reform is unique because it's a policy change that is inexpensive to implement and can even produce savings in enforcement costs. The takeaway from our study is that regulatory reform, not just increasing benefits and payments to parents, can play a role in helping families achieve their fertility goals. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna Claire. So the way this will work is I'm serving as our discussant, and I'll have one or two questions for presenters. I've made sure they're very difficult questions that they won't know the answer to. No. And then we'll go on to the next presenter, but then at the end, we will have a Q&A open to the audience as well. So if you have questions, you can jot them down or store them in your head. Just to clarify, do I understand rightly that what you are saying is if New York City had childcare regulations that were as unregulated, free, lax, whatever term we want to use, as Louisiana, that New York City could maybe expect to have 10% more babies per person, per woman?
So again, these are pattern predictions, meaning we haven't done that experiment yet. We haven't held people hostage and had them put their children in different childcare situations, right? But if you think about what a reform such as larger group sizes or just making some of those marginal changes in child to staff ratio, you could think of the savings that a childcare provider would have that would maybe invite new businesses to actually enter this field. It's known to be one of the industries with the lowest profit margins. And you hear people talk about, well, it's so expensive, but also the workers' wages are so low. So where is that money going in between the wages and the prices? It's going to overhead costs of people spending a lot of time making sure every box is checked, and quite literally that diverts attention away from the actual children. And so whether through a partnership with parents, and kind of just having, we expect a larger range of childcare options when it's easier to become a childcare provider. And so in the long run, we do expect parents to be able to find that right match and that right fit easier.
So given what I'm paying babysitters right now, I'm not sure I believe their wages are low, but. No, that was a softball question, so here's a harder one. So it's in some countries, 50, 60, 70% of kids are in childcare.
Mhm.
In other countries, 50, 60, 70% of kids are being watched by grandparents, aunts, neighbors. Do your findings tell us anything about paths forward for countries that maybe are having low fertility, but where most childcare is still basically traditional? Is there any, or community provided, is there any relevance that those countries might take from your findings? So I'm calling for you to speculate.
That's a great question, yeah. Speculatively, I think we see from this data that informal arrangements are often the alternative that people are going to when the formal licensed childcare is too expensive. And so allowing allowing the formal market to be more informal, I guess, would be speculatively helpful for families trying to, who maybe lose that informal source of support, right? Because grandma is going to be available if you need to drop your child off early in the morning, but a childcare center might not be. And so we're thinking of those families at the margin who may be losing that, that support as we move around with our families and things like that. So having just more in the direction of some of the advantages of informal care, I think are an implication of our findings, yes.
So a lightly regulated childcare market can have some of the advantages of informal care and some of the advantages of formal.
Yeah, exactly. So it's safe and reliable, and you have an online review system or something where you can make sure, but also.
My grandma's not a very good babysitter.
Right. So, yeah, thank you for the question.
Wonderful. Okay, our next presentation, I think we should have the PowerPoint coming up, is by Anson Zhou. He is an assistant professor in economics at the University of Hong Kong. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His research focuses on fertility, human capital, and equality. And because he's an energetic economist presenter type, he's going to stand up by there. I'll also say, I see many taking pictures of slides. That's great. That's fine. I would strongly encourage you, contact our presenters afterwards. Invite them to come to a university in your country to give a presentation. I'm sure they and their family would love to visit your country.
Well, thank you. Thank you for coming, and also thanks a little privilege and honor to present today to the audience. So this paper is called Asymmetric Fertility Elasticities, co-authored with my friend Sam at the University of Exeter in the UK, and Chung Pang, who is a student at the University of Hong Kong. I mean, the paper has a technical title, but actually just telling a very simple story. It's motivated by a very simple fact that we're facing the challenge of below replacement fertility rate. And this figure basically plots the evolution of the total fertility rates, namely the average number of kids that a woman has over her life cycle. And we're plotting that over a large set of countries. And as we all know, for many major economies, fertility rate has declined substantially and also below the replacement level. Let's just take the extreme example of South Korea. Imagine a high school of 100 students. In this generation, with ongoing fertility rate of 0.7 in South Korea, we expect to have 35 in this generation, and then 11 in next generation. So it's a dramatic decline in population if we face such low fertility rates in a country, and it has major implications for fiscal sustainability, like the pension system or business dynamism due to labor and demand, and also economic growth because people create ideas. So of course, many governments are aware of this problem and actively implementing family policies trying to combat very low fertility rates. But what is the problem? The problem is that boosting fertility seems to be extremely difficult. You read articles in Vox or the Wall Street Journal which say that you can't even pay people to have more kids. These countries tried everything from cash to patriotic calls to duties to reverse this declining fertility rates, and it didn't work. Or worldwide efforts to reverse the baby shortage are falling flat. So the current empirical evidence, or what people think in the policy circle, seems to be that the pro-fertility efforts are not really working. But what if you think about the other side, however, reducing fertility seems to be way easier. There are many countries with low fertility problems now who were reducing fertility not so long ago. One famous example is China, but there are many other countries. And now you look at Africa, many countries are reducing fertility now using various family policies. And if you look at this episode after the baby boom, kind of a narrative by Paul Altrich come along, and this history of reducing fertility, you see articles saying that did South Korea's population policy work too well? Or romance in Singapore, when yesterday's success of reducing fertility becomes today's challenges. Or sometimes national leaders like Khamenei in Iran would even apologize to the public saying, oh, we shouldn't have used such an effective policy on our population. We're doing history something wrong. So this leads to kind of the question that we are asking in this paper. Number one is, somehow, do we have any systematic evidence documenting that maybe fertility somehow responds more to anti-fertility policies or efforts, but responds less to pro-fertility ones? I think many of us in the room do have such kind of a sense or feeling, but we want to provide some empirical evidence that is more systematic and to evaluate whether this is true or not, and to which countries, to which population is this true. And a second, what could be the reason behind this, right? Can we write down either an economic model or a demographic model that can explain this phenomenon? And if we can, what are the policy implications? What can we tell you differently from the previous research? So we do have empirical findings, theoretical results, and policy implications. And it was a very big challenge for me to condense an 80-page paper into a 10-minute presentation. So we'll just have one slide on each, but feel free to contact me and we can chat more about details of each fact, okay? So regarding the data or the empirical findings, we collect data from the United Nations Population Division, where we collect data on the fertility levels and also policy stance. In other words, are they reducing fertility, raising fertility, or maintaining fertility, or having no policy intervention at all? We also collect some other sources from the World Value Survey, and World Table, and many other sources that we have a documented listing in the paper. We run several regressions or empirical analysis, and here are the three key empirical findings. Number one is that the total fertility rate, like the fertility flow, they fall rapidly after anti-fertility policies, but they do not rise substantially after pro-fertility policies. And second, the same conclusion or pattern holds for the completed fertility rates. In other words, even you look beyond the flows, you look at how many number of kids they end up actually having in the end of their fertile cycle, the same pattern holds. Number three, this asymmetry cannot be really explained by differences in policy intensity, namely how hard countries try, how much money you put in, cannot be explained by the types of policy instruments. Maybe you're using consumption in one direction versus tax in the other. It's not explained by that. And it's not explained by changes in birth timing, because number one, we look at completed fertility rate. So we look at the end of the fertile cycle. And also it's not due to liquidity constraints, because we see that this asymmetry, namely the fertility reduces a lot under anti-fertility policies and does not rise after pro-fertility, is actually more salient among richer and more educated women. So it's very unlikely to be explained by the liquidity constraint that you don't have money now if you want to postpone. It's not explained by that. So these are our empirical findings. They are quite surprising to me, and we just coined a term, asymmetric fertility elasticities, right? Easy to reduce, harder to increase, and that's asymmetric. Interestingly, this asymmetric fertility elasticities really challenge the traditional economic models. Because the traditional models, when you think about fertility choice, is typically a demand, and the demand curve, usually in the textbooks, are smooth. So along a smooth curve, it's very hard to find kinks or asymmetries. So in the theoretical part of the paper, we present a new economic model of fertility with loss aversion, and we show that it overturns many of the existing theoretical predictions, and also can explain our empirical findings. What is this idea of loss aversion? To put it in a very intuitive way, having a kid often implies sacrificing some aspects of life, say lifestyle, upon which people hate to compromise on. So we love kids, but for example, the left picture is called the rosy life of American dinks. Dinks meaning double income and no kid. And no joke, this was me and my wife like 2 years ago. And this was me and my wife like right now, or maybe last year. So if we think we deserve to be able to dine out every night or go to travel and have the flexibility of being in Japan one day, South Korea in another, having kids is a nightmare. If we think we desire this, but if the government wants to use some money to bribe us or patriotic calls to let us have one more kid and pushing us not having this, then we will be very reluctant to do that because we think we deserve this. It's our lifestyle reference, aspiration. On the right figure is a famous pattern of the child penalty, which basically shows that after men have a kid, either a biological or adopted kid, their earnings didn't really change much. If you compare the men who have a kid versus not having a kid, the income pass is relatively the same. But for women, I think this is for the United States, expect income decline or earnings decline of almost 20%, which is highly persistent after many years of having kids, either biological or adopted, meaning that women sacrifice more after having a kid. But putting your shoes in a woman who really wants to be a law firm partner, knowing that sacrificing 20% of your career prospect is a disastrous news. And if the government can say, hey, can you please have one more kid and sacrifice your career outcome for the country, I will give you $200. So you won't do that, right? So in other words, if people have the aspiration, if people have the reference of wanting a certain lifestyle or wanting such a labor market participation or career outcome as a woman who may have a better, larger say in fertility decisions, then reducing fertility is easy because you're making them achieve that, but raising fertility is hard because you're not letting them achieve that. And that is basically our theory. In the paper, it's much more mathematical, but here it's in the plain language of what that paper, what this model is. So what are the policy implications? Well, we show that with the loss aversion, namely when people have aspirations and desires, or they think what they deserve, fertility over the long term could fall even without changes in economic fundamentals. Maybe even your country is not undergoing industrialization or secularization, even without that, fertility can fall on its own. We call it a slippery slope perspective. What is the intuition behind? Well, with loss aversion, you have asymmetric fertility responses even to symmetric shocks, right? Because you're protective over your current lifestyle, so you have asymmetric responses. And then these asymmetric responses accumulate over time into rising lifestyle expectations. In the literature, it's known as the aesthetic hypothesis. In other words, what you think you deserve might depend on what you observe your parents or siblings are doing. So if your siblings are having a rising lifestyle, you might think you deserve that too. So over time, this lifestyle expectation would rise under symmetric shocks, and your fertility can decline under symmetric shocks, even without fundamentals changing. So what does this mean for policymakers? Well, if you're a policymaker thinking some number n star is the ideal fertility rate, like 2.1 or 2 or 1.5, depending on how much you like the environment versus economic growth and so on. If you think n star is the optimal long run, what we are saying is, if you have one opportunity to set the current fertility level using policies, what's the optimal level to set? You should set it higher. You have a precautionary motive to set it higher than whatever your long-term policy goal is. Why? Because whatever level you set, it can decline later. So if your long run is like 2.1 is the best, then currently you maybe should have set it at 2.3 because later you will decline to 2.1. So this is very different from the traditional way that we conduct family policies. Because traditionally, if you have a higher than 2.1, you reduce it. If you're lower than 2.1, you're gonna raise it. But what we are saying that even if you are still higher than 2.1, you might want to stop. You might want to stop earlier because it's going to decline later due to rising lifestyle expectations. And moreover, if you want to maintain a level of fertility at 1.9, you're happy with it. Your pro-fertility policy efforts needs to increase in time because you need to combat people's rising lifestyle expectations. So I think these are two different things that we tell the policymakers relative to the traditional way of thinking about them. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Anson. I really appreciate how your paper lays out the dilemma facing policymakers. So I want to pose the dilemma to you in concrete terms Let's imagine that I am India, and I have, well over 1 billion people in my country, and my fertility rate is just below replacement. India is about 2 right now. Given their mortality rates, their true replacement rate should be about 2.2. And let's say that you're India and you say, well, we're okay with a little bit of decline, maybe because you think maybe you'd like to have a little bit less density, but you don't want to have a catastrophic decline. So let's say you want to stay at 2.
Yeah.
Are you saying that India should be doing pronatal policy right now?
I think so. I think that's what the model implies. That with the growing kind of economic development and also lifestyle and also gender gaps is converging in India, I do think there are secular forces pushing fertility to go even lower in the future. And even without these, the rising life expectations would push fertility down if our theory is correct. So yes, I think our model would imply that India should stop kind of reducing fertility and might turn the course right now.
Okay. That's how I read your paper, so I'm glad that I did not misread. Now I start with an easy one, now I have to do the hard one. So there's a little bit of a tension between what you're saying here and what Anna Claire was talking about with the fertility gap. Because let's say I'm a policymaker and I say, look, I don't care about 2.1. I care about people having the number they want to have. So if my goal is 2.3, I'm asking you to do a bit of like political or even ethical speculation here. But if people want to have 2.3, is it okay for a policymaker to target 2.6? Isn't that nudging people to have unwanted children or even going against their free choices? So how should we think about the challenge between, for people to get what they want, a policymaker has to target more than they want? How should we think about that?
Yeah, I think like one clarification is that what I'm saying here is that if the policymaker wants 2.1, it should set up as 2.4 in the beginning. It's not exactly about what people want versus policymaker want. And if you want to talk about what people want versus what policymaker wants, it's kind of a big kind of literature of population ethics, and also what are the externalities, regarding fertility. Why can't we just let people be and do whatever they like? Maybe just 1.0 or 0.7. And because we know there's a fiscal externalities and economic growth externalities. So, I think from a policymaker's point of view, or even from reducing these externality point of view, there are efficiency reasons why we might want to intervene or want to change, what the outcome of fertility is, irrespective of, the asymmetry per se.
Great, thank you so much. All right, our third and final paper will be by Nagham Sayour. She is an associate professor of economics at Zayed University in Dubai, United Arab Emirates. She holds a PhD in economics from McGill University, near and dear to my heart, because I am also a McGill PhD candidate, though not in economics. Her research focuses on empirical microeconomics with a particular interest in labor economics, family economics, and policy evaluation.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for attending and for giving me let me stand up as the usual economist. My presentation is entitled Housing Affordability Crisis and Delayed Fertility, Evidence from the USA. And this is joint work with Dr. Elasticities from the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. So, what our paper is about housing affordability, which is a growing issue that is facing many cities and many countries around the world. And in some cases, the struggle is so severe that it's being characterized as a crisis. Now, what we're interested in is basically to study whether this housing affordability can affect community. In other words, can individuals be priced out of parenthood? And spoiler alert, the answer is yes. So, What we do in this paper is to present novel evidence on a mechanism through which housing and affordability reduces. So what is our hypothesis? We hypothesize that in societies where home ownership is a preferred norm to start childbearing, high housing prices will delay home ownership, which will delay the start of childbearing, which means that mothers will have a higher age when they start childbearing, and this will lead to lower fertility. So this is our main hypothesis. To make things simpler, we divide this hypothesis into 3 smaller hypotheses, so we can provide evidence on each one of these. So those 3 hypotheses, the first one is that the 10-year status affects the time to childbearing. So we hypothesize that renters are going to start childbearing later than owners. But we want to make sure that this is not due to some preferences for renters. We want to show that this is due to the hardship that the renters are facing to turn into home ownership. So our second hypothesis is the harder the transition to home ownership, basically, the higher the home prices relative to income, the longer the families, the renters, wait to have to start their childbearing. So putting those 2 hypotheses together, this tells us that renters are going to start childbearing at a later age. So you might say, so what, right? Even if they start later, a mother can still get 2 or maybe 3 children. However, we try to argue otherwise, especially in societies nowadays where the starting age of having a child is late 20s, early 30s. So delaying by a couple of years could have big consequences on completed fertility due to various reasons. An obvious reason is biological. Other reasons are economic, because as mothers are older, especially working mothers, the opportunity cost of having more children is much higher in terms of foregone income. So our third hypothesis is that the older the age at first birth, the lower the fertility. So putting all those 3 hypotheses together will tell us that housing and affordability leads to lower fertility. And basically in our paper, we try to present evidence for each one of these. We use so many different data sets. I'm not going to go into the details, but I'm happy to talk about if you need more details from different time periods to show that this phenomenon has been occurring at in the 2000s and recently as well. One of the main contributions of this paper is the methodology that we use, because we borrow this from the clinical literature. We use something called Cox proportional hazard model, but let me tell you briefly, simply what does this. So in the clinical literature, what they do is they compare 2 or more groups, and they compare the probability of an event happening. And they see if there's a difference in the probability of an event happening at a period of time. Usually this event is a death or some type of failure. We turn this into something more positive, which is the start of childbearing. And basically for the first hypothesis, we compare renters and homeowners, and we see at a point in time, what is the probability of them starting their childbearing. For the second hypothesis, we just restrict our sample to renters who actually have a child. And what we do is we check when the timing of start of childbearing happens, depending on housing prices in the area where they live. Now, here it's very important that we're comparing apples to apples, as we say in economics, right? So for this reason, we have several controls. So we make sure that the families that we're comparing have similar age, race, education for both parents. We control for whether the mother is in the labor force. whether she's actually working, but that's not enough. Because think about the second type. Think about maybe in a region with high housing prices, there are a lot of work opportunities for women. So those women might sort into those areas with housing prices because they have better career prospects. And they might delay childbirth, not for reasons related to home ownership. So to control for that, we have to also look at area level variables. So some of the variables that we control for is female manager rates in the area, to control for female aspiration, female career aspiration, female labor force participation rate, and many others. And for the last hypothesis, this is very simple. We just look at the age at first birth and the total number of children that a woman gets throughout her whole life, and we see whether the age at first birth affects that. Here it's very important to look within a generation, because we know that over time, the starting age of childbirth has increased and total fertility has decreased for different reasons. So we want to make sure that this is within the same generation. So what do we find? We find evidence for all three hypotheses. The first result is that renters delay childbirth significantly more than homeowners. Specifically, renters are 45.9% less likely to have a child at a given point in time compared to homeowners. And we show that this is due to the hurdles that renters are facing to move to home ownership. So renters in areas where housing is relatively unaffordable delay childbirth more. Specifically, the probability of having a child among renters decreases by 2% as relative housing prices increase. So this is telling us that renters are starting childbirth at an older age. And our third result shows that this correlates with reduced completed fertility. So we show that as the mother age at first birth increased by 1 year, her total completed fertility decreases by 0.04 children. To put this into perspective, given the current total completed fertility rate, this means that every year is decreasing completed fertility by 2%. So what are the implications of our study? Our study gives support to the policymakers and academics who are advocating for policies to solve the housing crisis. Because there is an urgent need for those policies. Because even if the housing crisis is solved soon, its effect will be long-lived demographic effect, which we call a hysteresis phenomenon in economics. So even if the event is solved now, its effect will be long-lasting. That's why there is need for urgent policies now. Now, what are those policies? There is a very big range of policies. They could include improved mortgage access in places where mortgage is difficult to get, to better rental housing options in cases where actually having home ownership is objectively hard. We do not advocate for any specific policy in this paper. Maybe this is something for the future to evaluate policies, but we call for preventative housing policies, not only reactive ones, in order to counteract the long-term demographic effects. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Nagham. My first question, so different policies for housing unaffordability. You mentioned mortgage access, rental things, but it strikes me that home ownership is the kind of the barrier you looked at here, which that makes sense to me. So different countries have different housing policies, but there are many countries that build a lot of housing, but only for like renting or for public use, right? So the government owns it and rents it out or something like that. I mean, I can think of, or even places where you own something, but you only own it for a 99-year lease or something. So I'm wondering, where does building fit into this? Is this telling us that building a lot of homes for private sale is really important for fertility? Or am I reading too much into this?
Well, this is a very good question. And it could be building homes for private sale, but it doesn't have to be. So even like, public homes, I guess what really matters is the stability that comes with the home ownership, right? And it all depends on the society. In the society, if home ownership is seen as a preferred norm to start childbearing, why is this a preferred norm? Is it because of the stability that it's giving? Right, so if this is what matters, then just giving this stability by having like long-term rentals or very affordable rentals might help start, solving this problem.
So that was actually the hard question I wanted to ask then. So okay, one solution here is obviously like help people become homeowners or something like that.
Yeah.
But you mentioned we observe this in societies that value homeownership. As a demographer, one of the classic things we learn in our graduate programs is Soviet countries had higher fertility and younger fertility, even though nobody owned their house, right? Now, I'm not saying, should we have communism now? That's not the question. The question is, would governments be better served discouraging homeownership as a norm? Would we be better off with governments that try to intervene on the idea rather than the policy? And I am aware that that's kind of I'm asking Everett a hard speculative question in seconds, so.
Yeah. I mean, well, something that we thought about is maybe over time, this norm will change by itself, right? Because you're gonna get to a point where you know that home ownership is almost impossible and you want to have kids. So actually, maybe the norm will change and there will be a new social norm, but this is not the preferred norm, right? So it's still your preferred norm, if it's up to you, is to have home ownership, but due to the constraints that you're having, things might shift by themselves into this unpreferred social norm.
Great. Or not great, that actually sounds very sad, but great presentation. Thank you. So those were our three presentations. They've given me a bit of time to just talk here. I'm not going to take very much time because I really do want to get to Q&As from all of you, but I'll just summarize what we've heard today. Three different presenters covering very different topics. Essentially, labor and business regulation for childcare, housing affordability and the many different things that touches on. General fertility postures by government generally. These are very different kinds of things. Many of us, when we think about family policy, we might just think about child allowances, baby bonuses. That might be what we think of first. And those things, love it. That's great. I'm a parent of 3 children. I'd love it if the government gave me more money for my kids. That'd be great. But family policy covers virtually all policy, because almost everything we do shapes the lives that families can live together. And because families are the building block of functional societies, it's important for governments to actually be thinking about how all these diffuse policies shaped and intermediate family life. Especially as fertility is declining. Today, our presentations were all about fertility. It didn't have to be that way. We welcomed people to submit papers about marriage or divorce as well. But I'll tell you the truth, every single submission we got for a paper was about fertility, about babies. Why? Because I don't know if you've seen Elon Musk's tweets recently, but fertility rates are falling all over the world. And not just in rich countries. I think we started by saying that over half the countries in the world have below replacement fertility rates. That's not just rich countries. We mentioned India is below replacement. Malaysia, of course, is I think 1.7 now approximately. You know, you can find in Maputo, in Mozambique, a city in Mozambique, recent data suggested that the fertility in urban Maputo was 2.2. This is not just a Europe and North America problem. Many countries will run out of young people long before they have reaped a demographic dividend. And so I hope that particularly Anson's advice that countries benefit from thinking about pronatal policy, pro-family policy, long before you've got a fertility rate of 0.7, can be taken to heart by many countries. And with that, we will open to audience Q&A. Anybody have any questions? We have a hand already up right there. Please go ahead and tell us your name and where you're from, and then who you're asking a question to.
My name is Bukaya. I'm the Director of Advocacy for the World Alliance. I'm from Cairo, Egypt. And since we left off with Dr. Nagham, the last point is actually very interesting. With your question, I kind of want to feed into another follow-up question. So you said that the preferred social norm that steers away from owning a house will inevitably have to take place, and that could be sort of how the flow of things occur, because the houses are not affordable, so the social norm would inevitably change or something of that sort. However, I was wondering, how would that affect the structure of the family unit as we know it, and the dynamic and how they live together? And also, I was wondering from an economic perspective, if the actual people who sell the houses, the constructors or the construction companies, would they kind of lower the prices if the demand is low? So it's like, I have two aspects of it.
Thank you for the question. So just a point for one thing, it doesn't have to become a new social norm. We hope that it doesn't, right? If the right policies are taken at the right time, that's what we're advocating for. We're advocating for policies to try to solve this housing crisis before it's too late. However, we think that if it's not solved, eventually, people will have to start thinking, and we do see in our data that people are getting children before moving to home ownership, right? So, however, they're getting them at a later age, right? Now, if the social norm, the new social norm is established, what I think is that this might counteract a little bit the problem of the late start of childhood. Because if I know that I'm gonna get this child anyways, right? While I'm renting, so I don't really have to wait until I save enough to move to a house. So maybe this will counteract the problem that we're facing. But I mean, personally, I think this is gonna take a very long time for this social norm to change, right? And it's not a favored social norm. It's something that people do not like. Now, when this happens, would that lead to a lower demand? And this, if the supply is still the same or the supply is higher, this would decrease the housing crisis. Could this be a solution? This is a very interesting question, but this is a very long-term effect, right? And by then, completed fertility would have been so low that, you know, it's too late.
Yes, my name is Azmil Mahmoud, and I'm from Malaysia. I'm the Ministry of Human and Community Development. Your paper, Doctor, about the connection between fertility and owning a house is very interesting. But I have some few questions, like how many percent that women own a house before they get married? First, And then at what age do they own that house? And the difference between the year that they own the house and the firstborn child. I'm pretty sure that back in Malaysia, the lowest the government is giving like specific subsidized house for 300,000 ringgit in Malaysia is equivalent to how much? Like 80,000 $80,000 for those who have not
Own the
have
house.
any house.
Yeah.
So we have not like make any analysis on the effect of giving this so-called like affordable house and the number of children that they will bring up. Normally, those who are like having that house, they have already like 1 or 2 kids. So we have to do some censoring effect on that data first. But I would like to know whether there is any policy that in your country, in US, that give special discount for those who wants to own a house and they are not having any children at all.
To my knowledge, thank you for the question, but to my knowledge, this a first time homeowners for new families, to my knowledge, is not available. But this is one thing that, we thought about as a very good policy, having subsidies specifically for those new couples that are still planning their families. This is a very good, this is a very good point, because then it will help them move faster to home ownership and will start the cycle of childbearing earlier. Now, in terms of women so what really matters is as a family, when you have home ownership and the percentage is still relatively high in the US, although the majority is owning at an older age, right? So the thing is, you want to target younger ages, right? Because if they're already an older couple who already have completed their total fertility, this is not gonna help reducing the problem. So yes, a very good policy would be, again, we need to try to evaluate that. This policy that you're talking about is very interesting. With the right data, it could be evaluated to see whether it has an effect. And ideally, if we can have a policy targeting just like new couples, that would be even better.
So I'll jump in briefly and say, there are a few countries that have done this. One famously is Hungary. Since 2015, new Hungarian married couples get a zero interest home loan. And then if they have children on a certain time, they get some of the principal forgiven. There has not yet been a high quality study specifically of the program, so economists, go find some good Hungarian data. The overall suite of policies Hungary has adopted have somewhat increased their fertility rate. Anson can tell you, the effect is not huge. The line does go up, but not by tons. But the housing policy that they tried did seem to have some effect.
There's a delegate.
Thank you so much. This is Magdalena from the Hungarian Mission.
Oh, yes. Sorry, I jumped on.
Yeah.
I see, but I would have said.
Great point. Thank you so much for this lovely event. It's such a needed topic. Thank you so much for the countries organizing and the NGO family. I think that these are the questions that are keeping my capital colleagues up at night. And also, I think previously aging was considered to be an European problem. We have been having an aging society since a long time. However, now we see that this is becoming a global problem with the world societies being aging societies by 2050. So this is a question that we really need to put on the UN agenda and get everybody involved in the discussion. So this is the best opportunity to do that. And I was very much struck by the presentations, how much in all these diverse contexts, our problems seem to be so similar right now. So this is extremely relevant for us. And I would fully agree with the points that the issue of family policies and the family perspective should be involved in all the policies, because they're all linked to the well-being and quality of life of our families. And then, of course, now we were discussing more the demographic side, fertility rates and numbers. But I wanted to emphasize how much this issue is inseparable from the well-being of families, including women and children and their quality of lives. So of course, we need to discuss numbers, but this has a human face as well that should be part of the discussion. I have a few comments, if you allow, and then a few follow-up to the presentations. Because for us in Hungary, we have been trying indeed to increase the fertility rates. And in the past years, we managed to achieve a lot of advances. We raised the fertility rate from 1.2 to 1.8. Now, in the past 2 years, we have seen a little bit of a decline despite the ongoing and the increased policies. So this is to also emphasize the subjective element to it, that there is so much that governments can do, but there is always a personal preference of people, perceptions of their future, global insecurity that can, all these externality that can then inform their decisions without us governments being able to do much about it. So this is a risk that, of course, should be always accepted. And there is, the government cannot force people to make decisions. We can provide good options. We can eliminate barriers. We can shape social norms. We can provide supports for their families to realize their family goals. And of course, we're encouraging families to have more children, so to also influence their family goals. But then, of course, there's limitations to how much us as governments can impede on the lives of families. And listening to the first discussion, it really stood out to me that it takes into account one aspect, the childcare, the availability and the options of childcare. But I was wondering, what about other factors that I didn't see in the control? So what about income security? What about job security? What about the availability of paid parental leave, which may also in the first half year or the first year or even more substitute for institutionalized childcare? So what about these that for us play also a very important role, and it's a continuum together with childcare? And my second question was, of course, the presentation was very specific to one country, and of course, there are, different countries are very diverse. However, it seemed to me that there is a dilemma in the presentation about having to choose between regulating childcare and making them available, and having regulated childcare that is not available and affordable. And what if the policy aim would be to provide high quality, affordable, and available childcare? And then what role the policymakers and other actors, what efforts could they make to achieve that? Because for us, that is really the overall aim, and we don't want to compromise on the quality to make the childcare be available for families. And just a final comment, if I may, I was very much also inspired by the presentation on the housing situation. We have a lot of policies to encourage first ownership, as we see that families delay the time of family foundation and having children. And of course, the later they start having children, the less children they're going to have. So we have a lot of programs and tax exemption and benefits and subsidized loans for that regard. So I also wanted to emphasize that for us, it's important to financially invest
into those policies. We put the money where our mouth is because we spend around 4% of our GDP on family policies. So it's really there. And this is a conversation that I will be taking back to them, because we always want to look at partners, learn from others, see what you do, what works, what doesn't work. And these considerations that you put forward were extremely interesting and will be much benefited from in our capital. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
We have another, we'd like to give some other delegates time to respond before we maybe have the panelists can. I believe there's Hiba, a question that.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the meeting, and I apologize, I jumped in late because the door said it's a closed meeting, so I got confused, so I missed part of the presentation, but I captured the whole idea of trying to do the interrelated or the correlation between the aptitude to have children at what age and linking it up to housing issues, or this is what I captured, but I believe. So I agree with many of what has been already mentioned by our colleague from Hungary relating to the other variables that come into question about this and how you can design family policy to capture all those elements into consideration. But I think it's not about ownership versus rental relations. It may be the perception of the security of housing tenure that is at question here. And maybe one of the answers would be having affordable, low-cost housing structures given to especially young families or nascent families, but not necessarily that it will resolve the issue. Urban development at large needs to capture this state policy when it comes to urban development and governing or regulating the real estate sector, whether it's purely like, there's no purely socialist structures now, but at least in certain settings and certain social and economic structures, it is important that when you regulate the real estate sector, you take care that you're addressing various strata of societies and addressing their needs in terms of the family need as a unit, but also as individuals themselves, and how you can have accessibility and affordability and quality of life, and such a perception of security of housing, which is part of also the perception of the right to an adequate standard of living at large. Having a decent life is a driver for people to have more children if they believe that their children will have a better life. But it links up again with all the elements that have been mentioned by our colleague from Hungary here relating to family policy, the economics of it, the child care support, how it happens, how also this impacts a woman's perception of her role as a mother, as opposed to being a contributor to the economy in the work sector, which is also an element that needs to be captured, not only her ability to own a housing unit or not. So these are elements that cannot really be separated or treated independently as fixed variables in a sense in economic terms. But thank you so much again for the
Thank you. Could have one more delegate, give one more comment or question, then we'll give it back to the panelists to answer, to respond. Any other delegate would like to ask a question? Please, if you could introduce yourself.
Thank you. Augustine Richard Kaketo from Uganda, Africa Policy Advisor for Family Watch International. My economist, Anson, the total fertility rate for Africa is at 5 right now. From your assessment, should Africa continue with the aggressive birth control programs, because it is actually cheaper to access contraception in Uganda than malaria treatment? Should we continue? Should we stop? Thank you.
I think I'll start with you.
Very tough questions. I think my answer is that the policy goal, like if you want kind of, what do you prioritize on? You prioritize on, say, education, or do you want to have a stable population in the long run, and at which time period, at which level of economic development? So I can't really give you kind of a concrete answer right now, but I think if I know how much asymmetry there is in the data and also what your policy goal is in the long run? What are the losses you perceive from, say, deviating from a 2.1? How large would that be an economic cost for you? I think I would be able to come up with more tailored kind of recommendation of what is high and what is low and when you should stop. That is context specific, but I think I don't know whether it's kind of 5 is too early at the moment.
Anson's cautious. I'll be less cautious. When we're driving a car, we should not put our feet on the brakes and the gas at the same time, but governments can. That is, it's actually perfectly reasonable to have people have good access to various kinds of contraception and also to be finding ways to support marriage, like through housing programs or have child allowances or have other kinds of birth supportive and promoting programs. I mean, if you give a family, when a family has a kid, they get a child allowance, that's going to encourage them to have a child somewhat. It's also going to help them purchase malarial treatments or preventatives for that child, right? That is, we don't have to have a trade-off between, efficient market-based access to, non-abortive contraceptives, and also supporting family formation. We can do both. And I think the countries that have been most successful at pronatal policy, which some of the most successful demonstrated policies to support fertility are in like Australia, Quebec, not currently, these are older policies, but in like Australia, Quebec, Hungary is of course a current case right now. Czechia has also had some recent successes. None of these are countries that got rid of contraception.
Yeah, thank you so much for your comments. I agree wholeheartedly that it's not a comfortable trade-off. And I can tell you there's been research when you're talking about along the margins, there's sort of described structural measures of quality, such as the actual inputs we can regulate. And then there's these process measures of quality that no matter what we do to kind of control the childcare space, there can be a lot of variation in the actual child educational outcomes, that kind of thing that the children receive in terms of just the quality of those interactions with adults. I will say my research is more relevant for countries who maybe a universal childcare system that affordable and high quality and accessible might not be politically feasible right now. Or you just kind of are weighing the fiscal costs of it and it's not doable right now. So I applaud all the efforts that have been made to make that accessible. And just kind of our study recognizes that in some countries that hasn't been a politically feasible or fiscally feasible ideal to achieve yet. And so what do we do in those situations? But thank you.
So very quickly, it's very interesting to know about all those policies that Hungary has. And I really hope that you also have like good data hand in hand with that to be able to evaluate those policies, right? Because you're saying 4% of your GDP is going to those policies. Is this paying off? I mean, this is something that economists would love, to have and to evaluate. So we can talk more about that later on. And regarding the second comment, yes, security matters. So if home ownership is not achievable, but you can provide this kind of security through rental housing later on, better options, that could be a viable solution. It all depends on the context.
And before we close off, I'd like to give the floor to, we have a vice minister. Please, if you could introduce yourself and maybe present a comment or a statement.
Yes, hi everyone. My name is the Vice Minister on Population and Family Development in Indonesia. This is a relatively new ministry because the ministry is just formed on October 2024 when President Prabowo Subianto was inaugurated. So this is also a commitment from the president about family planning and family issues. And so we can collaborate more and coordinate more with other ministry to provide more effective family planning program, housing with the Ministry of Housing and also childcare. so we can have more women enter the workforce. So we are also paying close attention to the situation in lots of countries where the low fertility rate is happening. In Indonesia, we have the total fertility rate of 2.1. It's actually at the replacement rate. So because we know what's the trend are, and they are very different from one province to another province. As you know, Indonesia is a vast archipelago with 17,000 more islands. We have 38 provinces, and the total fertility rates, of course, differs from one province to another. So my question is, do you have any mathematical model that probably shows, is there any number that for the total fertility rate to be irreversible? As we know that Hungary also already shared with us that we managed to raise the total fertility rate from 1.2 to 1.8. So is there any specific number that we need to look out for? Thank you.
My first impression is that it's starting something that I think we call it the low fertility trap. But as an economist, I personally don't believe it in the sense that if you give everybody $1 million to have a kid, they will respond because that's the incentives. That's how people do. But I think we should be kind of aware of certain propagation mechanisms like peer pressure or the social infrastructure or political infrastructure surrounding that. But I don't think there's a specific number that, there's no comeback threshold per se. I think Hungary has a good example where you can come back from very low levels. Yeah, we don't know how the long run would go, but at least temporarily you can go up.
So I think what we would say there's not a number that you could, there's not like, oh, you hit 0.7, you could never come back. But as Anson was showing in his presentation, it's always harder to go up than down, right? So it's not that if you go to 1.9, you can't come back, but it's that going from 2.1 to 1.9 will be very easy. Going from 1.9 back to 2.1 will be very difficult.
Yeah.
So avoiding the fall in the first place is always going to save public resources.
Thank you so much to all of the panelists, to everyone who presented comments or asked questions. We'll make sure to post this video on the NGO Committee and the family website in a couple of days. I believe the panelists and the group will stay around for a little bit, so if you're welcome to ask questions, share contact information. This will be a fruitful opportunity to share their research with you, email their papers, etc. And on behalf of the NGO Family Committee, again, thank you all for attending. We hope you have a great rest of the Commission on Population Development. And thank you again, Your Excellency.